Let's see if we can get this going. There we go. All right, so thank you, Mayor. Thank you, AP, for having me here. I always enjoy these kind of talks, especially if I can speak about how the humanities intersect with other areas and make sure that we continue to think about them as relevant. So I'll start with a really strange anecdote that kind of was a serendipitous moment this morning. I tend to get a news feed from the University of Cincinnati, and this morning I looked at the news feed and I noticed that there was an article on one of our Department of Classics faculty who has been working in Pompeii with drones on the sort of remapping of Pompeii with the use of drones. And the article that actually appeared in Popular Science, which is already kind of an indication of where we're going with all of this. But the article basically says that what they're doing right now is they're using drones as a way to look at what were long-held assumptions about Pompeii and trying to determine if in fact our assumptions are mistaken. And one of the things that they have discovered is that there is a big sort of quadrangular square in Pompeii that they thought was, because of it being so open, they thought was an area where gladiators trained. Well, the drones actually revealed that underneath the surface there is a circular structure in the middle, which actually suggests that this was not at all a gladiator space, but it was in fact a marketplace. And so once they started excavating in here, they started actually finding very interesting things, like they started finding that what kind of foods they were eating, this kind of stuff. But what is really interesting for the talk tonight is that at the same time, they interviewed an aerospace engineer about this use of drones. And the aerospace engineer said, well, what we're looking at is we're looking at the way that these archaeologists are looking at exploration as a way to sort of plan our own decision to try to send drone-like structures to Mars and look at what is beneath the surface of Mars, because we know, and this will be part of my end of my presentation, we know that there are these strange channels in Mars that suggest that there was water. So they want to look at below the surface without disturbing the surface. And this is the easiest way not to sort of upset structures. And I thought, how interesting that on a day when I'm talking about the juncture of humanity and science, an article like that appears on my news feed. So I said, no, it's good luck. It's good. It's a good sign. Okay, so before I really go into the presentation, I want to tell you how I got involved in sort of conjoining humanities and sciences. And this happened when I was at the University of Colorado, and our aerospace engineering group faculty decided that they wanted to start a space minor. And very openly, they decided to make it a call in the college, throughout the university, to see who might be interested in supporting this minor. And I was like, this sounds like a great idea for collaboration. Little did I know that they would then pull me in to say, okay, since you have this interest, why don't you sort of participate by giving us the humanist view of what it means to be involved in space exploration? I said, okay, what does it involve? Well, they put me in front of a camera. They made a little lecture that I actually shared with AP, which is probably the reason I'm here. And every year now in January, I go for the initial lecture of this space minor, the only course that is actually required for the minor. And I give a presentation on space and wonder. So this is kind of a evolution of that, and it's a great fun. A lot of interactive activities. We also even pretend to take a time machine and we go off in some different place, and the kids throw little objects at us. But it's a lot of fun. So and it is. To me, it's beautiful because it actually shows that we can actually collaborate across divisions and disciplines. So I'll start today, and if you have questions, obviously later we can get in more detail. This is kind of an overview of what I'm thinking about. So the journey that mankind has undertaken to understand its relationship to space has been inextricably linked to the humanistic adventure of the past 10,000 years. Tonight, I'm not trying to cover new ground and explain what the relationship might be. What I want to convey is the particular humanities. Do I have to talk in this thing? Yes. Do you hear me now? I have a microphone, but it's not working. So of course I got distracted because I do this. And so I just kind of moved away from the microphone. But now that I've been told what to do, I'll do it. What I want to convey is the particular humanities and humanistic foundation of the journey that ties knowledge, wonder, and the creative aspiration of humankind to the vast expanses of the space that surrounds us. While science is leading us into the deeper exploration of our relationship with galaxies and the universe, there wouldn't exist space exploration and there cannot continue to be space discovery without deep ties to the pursuits of the humanities. Let me pause for a second, and for the sake, my sake, but also the sake of the audience, I want to define when I talk about humanities, what am I talking about? I encompass those fields: literature, philosophy, religious studies, history, classics, and even anthropology, archaeology, and art that have been linked to the aesthetics, ethics, and preservation of human society. These are fields that too many today consider slightly on the fluffy side of things, but which, in my view, are indispensable to continue pursuing the Greek concept of eudaimonia, good life, which, from the origins of time, has been central, I believe, to our existence. So I would like to begin today's exploration with a personally iconic image that has intrigued me and remained with me since the first time I saw it. Good. Some people, those of my generation, will recognize this still from the 1968 movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick. The photo presents an impossibility since it shows the sun and moon in an alignment that could never be revealed in the way that is presented here. Thematically, the image introduces the monolith, which, in its many interpretations, represents a transition from one level of cognition to another on the evolutionary scale, each of the 4 times it appears in the movie. 2001, which relies on fictional humanistic devices, I should point out, like storytelling and film, to transmit its deeper objectives, renders centrally some of the questions that are as old as human consciousness and which undoubtedly our ancestors began asking at the dawn of conscious time when they encountered spectacles like this. And here I ask you all to sort of like allow me a little bit of freedom, because what I'm going to try to do here is try to replicate the voice of a newly developed consciousness that comes in touch with this spectacle. So how might someone relate to this? I mean, how would they say, what is this about? What are these lights? Who sends them? Why are we here? What lies in those lights far above us? If enemies can strike and friends appear from the ground, what do the vast expanse and those lights hide for us, good or bad? Are those lights in the universe's vault random? Is there a rhyme and reason for their existence? And just as importantly, how do we get there? So this is, obviously trying to create a little bit of thinking in there. But let us come back to Kubrick's title, because it contains in a nutshell the essence of the humanistic pursuit of space. 2001: A Space Odyssey. The juxtaposition of space and Odyssey is significant in itself. It underscores a foundational myth of humankind, that of the journey or quest, but transposed through space. In its original framing, this journey is tied to the hero Odysseus and is characterized by numerous adventures that lead to discovery and knowledge, which for the hero can be both good and bad, but eventually enables him to grow and return home transformed, if not always better off. The same concept has become central to another image I often use when talking about the ties between humanities and space, and which might be more familiar to any younger audiences. As many Trekkie know, this is the spaceship Voyager, a spaceship that is transported to a far quadrant of the universe, whence it attempts to come home, in the process discovering new worlds and cultures, and engaging old and new friends and foes alike. The visuals of Space Odyssey and Voyager underscore the relationship we humans have with space, whether we understand it as the final frontier into exospace, or simply what lies beyond what we know from our strolls in the neighborhood. It is a need to fill the space with stories, because space is both the expanse our own Earth occupies and the term we use to define what is between the here and the there. We fill it with stories, hoping that those stories can build up on each other and fill it even more. At the dawn of mankind, human consciousness discovered, and we might say created, the concept of time, and discovered that not all time was the same. In fact, in Bergsonian fashion, time carries in its intervals changes in the perception of being. How might this have occurred as our ancestors found patterns in the way the shining globe of the sun gave way to the opacity of the night with its million stars, and the moon cycled through its phases in the skies? In those transitions, we can imagine how human beings began interrogating themselves about the rhythms of the moon and its intervals with the sun, as well as that stellar density that became then the Milky Way. So let me use this Milky Way to give us one way to see how it might have happened when people saw the galaxy appear in the night sky. In Greek mythology, this was Hera's spilled milk when she discovered that Heracles was not her son, but Venus's. For the Cherokees, it was the cornmeal spilled by a dog. In the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish, it was the result of the severed tail of the dragoness Tiamat after Marduk slayed her. And many other cultures have such stories about its formation. Space and what lies beyond, unexplained or yet only partially explained, became a big canvas on which to project our humanity, its fears, its cultural working outs. Again, the Greeks provide an example of how jealousy and the bond between mother and son might be explained. In English, we call these the Big and Little Dipper. It makes sense. They look like scoops, though I used to think of them as wheelbarrows personally. Yet, for the Greeks, and especially the Roman, from whom we get the names, they were Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. How did they acquire these names and become forever linked in the astronomical language? Because an angry Hera was on the lookout for Zeus and Callisto, his lover. And Zeus hid the relationship by transforming Callisto into a bear. Unfortunately for Zeus, but actually a lot more for Callisto, the plan backfired when Callisto's son, who happened to be hunting, pierced the bear's heart with an arrow before realizing it was his mother. Zeus found out, and both to keep the mother and son together and to hide the obvious peccadillo from Hera, first transformed the son into a bear and then moved them both into the sky, where they remain side by side to this day. Thus, from the dawn of time, we have not stopped to project onto the sky our thoughts and fears, and projecting our emotions as well as the sense of wonder of what lies beyond. And it is out of this desire to map the sky with our metaphors, our dreams, our fears, that astronomy and its twin offbeat sister, astrology, were born. And indeed, a much more modern version of these, the science of archaeoastronomy, has suggested that the number of structures we know today were created to understand and make sense of the world above us. For example, Stonehenge might have been an astronomical observatory that gave Celtic inhabitants coordinates to understand the passing of the season. Or the Pyramid of Giza, which align well with the belt of Orion and are also believed to align accurately with the 4 cardinal points, suggest an attempt to connect the world of the dead with the world of air and space. A similar connection with the belt of Orion has been suggested for the pyramids of the sun and the moon in Mexico City, even as their name already indicates a relationship with the celestial bodies above. Our ancestors wanted to connect with the sky, and to do so they created structures that would bridge that gap. This brings me to a more significant way in which human structures might have attempted to connect with space. Not only did the sky, and especially the night sky, become a way to read and interpret the world, but the sky itself and its constellation might have provided in a theory first advanced in the early 20th century, but more forcefully pursued since 1969, the original impetus for the alphabet. The theory suggests that our ancestors used the constellations above to tell stories about our existence, as we know, for example, from Greek myths, and that they used them even more practically to create the written signs with which they could translate oral stories into a more permanent record of their thoughts about space. Which leads me to two thoughts I would like the audience to consider as I share them with you here. There might exist no written language without the storytelling associated with space, and space exploration is all about translation. Some of you might not have trouble agreeing with the first idea given what I've just said. As we have noticed, when ancient tribes began telling stories about how the stars were placed in the sky, oral storytelling sufficed until someone decided to codify them for successive generations. The stars and their positioning might have then provided us with visual clues for how to transmit those ideas and sounds by providing the rudiments of the first alphabets. The second one requires a different viewpoint. As someone who has made a career writing about translation, which is what I've done, I might be expected, self-servingly, to interpret reality through its lens. Yet, I ask you to consider this claim by returning to my initial thoughts about space being both a noun applied to the mass we call the universe, and the gap between the here, Earth, and the there, everything in the great beyond. If translation, in its etymological meaning, is to carry through or carry across, then our relationship with space is all about translation. It is a carrying across from thoughts into words, from observation into stories, and even from stories into action. More importantly, it is about carrying us across the vast expanse that separates us from the answers we have sought since ancient times. So when origin stories in a variety of cultures make the sky an interlocutor in our understanding of the reality we call Earth, it is because we try to explain the unexplained in a way that even today is affirmed by our search for meaning in a universe which finds most practical expressions in space exploration. How appropriate then that among the foundational myths of humanity's relationship with space and the heavens above, we find one of the most famous stories in the Bible, that of the Tower of Babel, the attempts by giants and human beings to reach God. Here, men work together to achieve this goal. As the story goes, God does not approve of this attempt and defeats their quest by confounding their languages so they can no longer communicate, and their efforts to continue building the tower fail. This attempt by human beings to bridge the gap with the heavens is hindered by a gap of understanding. And this wondrous feat of human architecture, which corresponds to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, remains incomplete. Language, stories, and the attempt to bridge the gap with space intersect once more. Here, however, the metaphor is that the confusion of languages our ancestors experienced, even in ancient times, is a hindrance to our ability to understand the universe. And that only when we find a common language, and one could suggest that in fact aerospace studies is such a language, can we hope to solve the riddles of the universe. Balanced against the metaphor, as in many of the myths of origins, is the idea that an omnipresent being who resides in the expanse above controls how and when we humans might be expected to achieve this ultimate goal. Religion and its studies are not, as Marx once suggested, the opiate of the people. Religion fulfills our human need to bridge gaps of understanding, and translation, as the famous literary critic George Steiner would remind us, is the key for how we can try to achieve that goal. How then might this desire to translate the awesome gap of understanding based in religion be expressed in a more concrete outcome? For the Greeks, the traditional liberal arts included 3 sciences: math, geometry, and astronomy, which all relate in some way to the desire to bridge the distance between the here and the there, the human and the ethereal, reality and the wondrous. As for other cultures, and I can think of the Egyptian culture, Chinese, Arabic cultures, each in one way or the other, through theory and practical applications of that theory, create formulas to explain the relationship with the sky. The sciences I just mentioned help order the cultivating of our fields, and they allowed us to divide time according to the rise and fall of the sun, the cycle of the moon, and the apparition and transition of stars through the celestial vault. At the same time, these rhythms and their formulas needed to be translated into a language that made sense to our ancestors, so they could know and give coherence to what they did. And this knowledge became the point of reference for all that humans did in the fields and their rituals and their festivals, and created the myths that often accompany all of these time frames. Though unknown, the sky and space became the means by which human beings attempted to categorize both what's in the heavens above and what happens in the earth below. And for the longest time, that is what their relationship was: the unknown skies with gods, animals, and shooting stars that fly over Bethlehem to announce the birth of the divine Jesus, and us human beings always looking for answers that are not easily forthcoming. It comes as no surprise, then, that in the quest to bridge the gap, our stories would move on parallel tracks from the mythological into the literary, from religion into philosophy, and eventually back into literature. And from the literary into practical applications as primitive devices attempted to launch mankind in space. In literature, already in the 9th century BCE, according to the Mahabharata, King Raivata Kakudni traveled to the heavens to ask favors of Brahma, only to return to Earth and find that centuries had passed, the first instance of time travel documented in literature. Elsewhere, beings in the clouds met also with humans, as in Aristophanes, and semi-mechanical beings began pacing the Earth, while in the 2nd century Common Era, Lucian of Samosata's True History made the protagonist visit the moon, meet alien people, and participate in interplanetary warfare. On a parallel track, feathers attached to bodies appear in Chinese account from the 1st century Common Era, and in the 9th century, the Moorish inventor Abbas ibn Firnas survived a short flight in Cordoba with wings made of vulture feathers. So let me jump ahead a couple hundred years forth, and for my own purposes, discuss one of the great epic journeys in the Western world, Dante's Divine Comedy. Here, the literary pursuit moves to the next level of the Odyssey journey, making the literary I, as pilgrim and author, undertake a trip in the afterlife that, through the most famous inferno, eventually reaches the ethereal Paradiso. Dante's journey is intriguing for many reasons, none more so than because, repeatedly in the Paradiso, the author tells us how unspeakable and impossible it is to describe God and this paradise, and therefore his words suffer in comparison. Again, the untranslatability of the great beyond rears its head. And sometimes it reminds me of how difficult for us it is still to understand what a black hole really is. Elsewhere, I've discussed how when juxtaposing the Divine Comedy to his previous work, the De Vulgari Eloquentia, about the vulgar language, the common language, on the origins of the Italian language, Dante refers pointedly to the story of Babel as the event where languages lost their unifying quality while still maintaining the connection with the divine origin God. His own trip then becomes an attempt to use language and literature to translate this linguistic divide and provide his countrymen with a new language that might help bridge the gap. Meanwhile, referencing previous traditions, Dante returns us to the ideas that the skies above and the mystery they convey rely on divine design, mathematically and geometrically induced, to depict an intelligent meaning for the vast expanse above. Dante is just the most egregious example of the epic journeys that, having somewhat exhausted their terrestrial wanderings, from Gilgamesh to the Odyssey via the Aeneid, move first into the stratosphere and eventually all the way into the exosphere. In doing so, they document the constant lifting of our human horizons from the boundaries of the ancestral cities toward the expanses of our known seas into the curvature of the unknown seas, all the way upward into the vaults of the air around us. Dante's innovation is that he no longer talks about others making the journey in the third person, but as an I as author and protagonist. This is a crucial distinction because it moves the utopian travel into space from something we attribute to others, hence more distance from our ability to pursue it, to the eye of our own consciousness, allowing us to imagine ourselves as protagonists undertaking such trip, and inviting followers to imagine ways in which they too can start thinking about bridging the gap into space. So it comes as no surprise that as Dante's Middle Ages open up in the European Renaissance and beyond, and I want to stop here a second because I'm obviously talking from a Western perspective. I do know that in China, there were attempts to actually attach human beings to kites so they could fly. But a lot of times it wasn't as a way to sort of discover what was in the beyond. It was mostly for military missions, trying to figure out what was going on with the enemy. But so as the Middle Ages open up in the European Renaissance and beyond, we would see in the early 16th century new and ever more daring attempts to transform the flights of fancy of the imagination, such as the travels of the hero Astolfo to the moon to retrieve the brain of the eponymous hero of Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, into practical contraptions that would allow sustained and longer flight ventures into the stratosphere and eventually out of it, such as Leonardo's early helicopters. And 1 century later, on parallel pathways, Kepler's Somnium, considered by both Isaac Asimov and Carl Sagan the first science fiction novel, and Galileo's discovery that air had weight, would continue the buildup that led to the experimentation of the Brazilian priest Bartolomeu de Guzman with hot air balloons in 1709, and the momentous date of 1783, when the brothers Montgolfier launched the first manned flight, opening up the successive experimentations that led to the first dirigible, which means steerable balloon, in 1884. Poignantly, the construction of the first dirigible comes at the end of an era of Western exploration marked by the imperialistic and colonial occupation of Africa, Asia, and Oceania. And only a handful of years after 1877 is the year, the discovery by the Italian Giovanni Schiaparelli of canali on Mars, which are channels on Mars. Having colonized the planet, the human imagination moves itself upward, looking for its expansion skyward. Again, translation plays a particular role here because Schiaparelli's Italian canali was translated as canals, creating the illusion that these dried up water conduits had been man-made. And here's where the story leads me back to Arizona and my former place of residence, because Percival Lowell, of the wealthy Boston Brahmin family, came to Flagstaff, and from his private observatory, which is today the world-renowned site of Lowell Observatory, determined the canali to be real canals that had been built by a fictional humanoid species of Martians in 1898, creating a new impetus to see the red planet as a source for science fiction's imagination. Lowell, by the way, maintained this belief until 1916 when he died. But now I would like to ask a question. Was really Lowell the origin of these impulses? Or might he himself had been influenced by the father of science fiction, H.G. Wells, who between 1895 and 1898 published progressively more daring science fiction novels that detailed both human travel in time and through space, The Time Machine, but that culminated in the 1898 publication of The War of the Worlds, where, not surprisingly, the Earth is being invaded by, as you might have guessed, Martians. Thus, the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century sees an acceleration of scientific discoveries and technological innovation, as attested by the invention of the dirigible, and coincides with the era that we, humanists, associate with modernism and its twin sister, avant-garde. An era where the humanities and science intertwine ever more tightly in their mutual push towards new frontiers to discover. Questions about our presence in the universe expand philosophical thought in the branch of humanities called existentialism. Even as the breakdown of the atom and the discovery of X-rays by Röntgen parallels Freud's splitting of human consciousness into multiple levels. And lest we forget, here too, literary precedents provide the impetus for the birth of psychoanalysis. And these are discoveries that we see replicated in the stream of consciousness and multiple perspective narratives of James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. This acceleration and diffraction of reality moves us into the new art of the cinema and into the technological advances of full-fledged industrialization, such as the invention of the car and of the airplane. but also to further gazing up in the stars by increasingly powerful telescopes, scanning the heavens for signs of alien life and new worlds to explore. So in turn, in a perennial game of catch me if you can, space discovery and the humanities challenge each other with creating new ways to expand the realm of what is possible through fantasy, but also through technological advances that continue to expand our reach outside of our earthly confines. Without detailing the interval that passes between the 1920s to the invention of the television and later to the first rockets and spaceships, as well as the fantasy worlds of Herbert and Asimov, the evolution side by side of fantasy and reality has brought us now, in this misnomered third millennium, to envision a future where living in the stars is no longer a utopia. Conversely, this exosphere has become a place where our human emotions and passions continue to play out, just like they did for the Greeks when Hera and Zeus fought their anthropomorphic battles of emotions on the vault of the sky. Think about the slew of movies and TV programs and fictions that use the cosmos as a testing for our own inner and outer conflicts, or to impart moral lessons about who we were, are, or might become, or the changes that we see ourselves in our society. And I'm reminded of some of the controversy that came from certain certain areas when Star Trek Discovery came out in 2017. And there was a question because all the leaders in Star Trek Discovery are not white. So there was this idea that what is happening, I mean, most of the leaders are multicultural, there's a real change, and it reflects, I think, in some ways, our own trying to understand who we are and how we are becoming. So before I conclude, I would like to conclude with a little bit of a call to action. Space has held the fascination of human beings from the dawn of civilization, from the clever theories and religious rites of Ptolemaic rulers to the epical cosmogony of Gilgamesh and the Old Testament, from the wondrous creation of the afterlife in Dante's Divine Comedy to the depiction of comets in the arts of Giotto and Dürer. These typically artistic representations fed the awe and wonder that for generations inspired human enterprises towards space. More recently, creative representations of dystopic and utopic universes and of the space that encloses them have gone hand in hand with setting expectations for the development of scientific research into space. The juxtaposition of art, science, and public policy as well has been integral for the growth of our understanding of space as a trope of human existence. In an era that often sidelined the arts and humanities in favor of pragmatic fields of exploration, humanistic and creative endeavor might continue to provide useful interpretive keys to understand the universe that surrounds us. By confronting ourselves with other artists and humanists, and by engaging other fields of knowledge in the exploration of the wondrous, one can create new theoretical and pragmatic avenues of collaboration between the arts, the humanities, and the sciences in defining the role that wonder plays in our pursuit of space. So I would say that space science needs the humanities. And I want to quote Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, who once said, "We need to have people up there who can communicate what it feels like, not just pilots and engineers." He was talking of storytellers and artists, of those who their ability to reinterpret reality and present it through novel perspectives can reconnect us to the sense of wonder that gazing in the celestial vault produced for our ancestors. Now more than ever, as we question how long the Earth will sustain us, and whether we might sustain life by transferring our civilizations to other planets, we need artists and humanists to cross over into the vision of science and translate the beautiful awe that the universe represents. Similarly, on the other side of this constructed divide, we should help the engineers, politicians, and scientists who enable us to reach further into the galaxies to tell their stories persuasively, with a sense of wonder, so more of us can push for the growth of science into new discoveries and maintain the connection with what makes us human. Thank you.